The road into Marrow Hollow had been forgotten so thoroughly that grass grew up through the ruts where wagon wheels once ran, and it was down this road, on a raw morning at the tail end of March, that Della Rourke came walking beside a mule that would not hurry, carrying everything she owned in a single canvas sack. She was 26, and already a widow, and the folk who watched her pass from behind their curtains would remember, later, how straight she held her back, as though grief were a thing you could refuse to stoop under if only you were stubborn enough about it. Her name meant nothing to them yet. What they knew was the story, and the story had gone ahead of her the way stories do in small places. The Mill widow, the one who'd spent her last $12 on the ruin at the end of the Coldwater Turnpike, the toll house nobody had crossed in 30 years, the bridge the county had all but struck from its maps. $12. They said it the way you'd name a fever. Della had heard the laughing already before she ever reached the town. She had heard it in the way the man at the land office counted her coins twice, slowly, before he slid the deed across the counter with 2 fingers as though it might be catching. She had heard it when he said, "You do understand, ma'am, there's no living out there, no neighbours to speak of, just the bridge, and the bridge don't go anywhere anymore." She had signed her name in a hand that did not shake, and taken the deed, and walked out into the cold with the whole of her future folded into her coat pocket, no bigger than a letter. Behind her came Barrow. The mule was old, older than her marriage had been, older maybe than her grief. He was dust brown, with a muzzle gone grey as ash, and one ear torn ragged from some long-ago quarrel. He walked the way he did everything, slow and certain, planting each hoof as if he had personally decided the ground could be trusted. He was the last living thing her husband had left her that the debt collectors had not carried off, and only because not one of them had wanted him. "That mule," the bankman had said, curling his lip, "isn't worth the rope to lead him." And Della had looked at the animal, and the animal had looked back with his patient, unbothered eyes, and something in her had gone quiet and fierce all at once. She had kept the rope. She had kept the mule. They came into Marrow Hollow together near midday, and the town did what towns do. The general store stood at the crossroads, with its porch full of men who had nowhere better to be, and it was from that porch that the first voice reached her, heavy, amused, pleased with itself. Silas Hone owned the store, and, in his own estimation, a good portion of the sense in that county besides. He was a big man, gone soft in the middle, red in the face from good eating, and across his vest hung a gold watch chain he had a habit of hooking his thumb behind when he was about to say something he thought clever. He hooked it now. "Well, now," he called, loud enough for the porch and the street and the good Lord himself. "If it ain't the lady of the manor. Come to collect your tolls?" The men on the porch laughed, not cruelly, most of them just easily, glad the foolishness belonged to somebody else. $12, Silas said. "I've thrown more than that down a well and felt better about it," and the laughing rolled again. Della did not stop walking. She turned her head, met Silas Hone's eye, and said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, "Good day to you, Mr. Hone." Then she looked forward and kept on, and the very calmness of it took the wind out of the porch, so that the laughter petered into muttering, and the muttering into the ordinary sounds of a town at noon. But she had heard it, and would go on hearing it for a long time. A town like Marrow Hollow had decided what she was before she'd unpacked her sack, and a decision like that is a heavy stone to roll uphill. There was one person who did not laugh. Widow Pruitt stood outside the store as Della passed, a thin, stooped little woman with a silver bun coming loose, and a shawl of faded blue drawn tight against the cold. She had buried more people than she could comfortably count, and she knew the particular look of a young woman carrying a fresh grave inside her. She called out nothing clever. She only stepped down off the boardwalk, laid one dry, light hand on Della's sleeve, and said, quietly, so the porch could not hear, "You come to me, girl, if you find yourself short. I'm the little house past the churchyard, the one with the blue door. Don't you be too proud to come." Della had not wept once, not at the funeral, not at the land office, not on the long road with her whole life in a sack, but she came near it then, and had to swallow before she could answer. "Thank you," she managed. And Widow Pruitt patted her arm once more and let her go, watching after her with old sorrowing eyes as the young widow and the old mule went on out of town, toward the trees, toward the river, toward the ruin at the end of the road. The toll house of the Coldwater Turnpike sat where the road at last gave out at the water's edge, and it was, Della would not pretend otherwise, a wreck, a small square building of grey weathered plank, hunched at the mouth of the covered bridge, like something that had crept there to die and then thought better of it and simply stayed. Half the shingles were gone, and those that remained had curled up like old leaves. The chimney had shed a scatter of bricks into the weeds. One window still held its glass, milky and blind with grime. The other was a black empty square through which the wind walked as it pleased. And beyond stood the bridge itself, its long timber flank silvered by 30 winters, its roof sagging like the spine of an old horse, its mouth gaping dark over a river that ran on beneath it, indifferent, as it had long before there were any tolls to pay. Della stood at the edge of what had been the yard, the deed in her pocket and the mule at her shoulder, and looked at the place that was now, God help her, home. She did not let herself weigh it against the house she'd left. The little rented rooms in the mill town, the bed still warm in her memory with a man who would never lie in it again. She had learnt already, in the short brutal school of her widowhood, that some sums you simply could not afford to work, because the answer was a thing you could not carry and keep walking. Instead, she said, out loud, to the mule and the bridge and the cold river, "Well, it's ours." And she went in to see about a fire. The weeks that followed were the hardest work of her life, and Della Rourke had never been a stranger to hard work. She patched the roof first, because a roof was the difference between misery and disaster, and the March rains were coming. She had no money for shingles, so she made do flattened tin from cans. Cedar shakes she split herself from a downed tree with her husband's old hatchet, a scavenged board here and there. She climbed up onto that curling roof in the raw cold, with her honey-brown hair braided tight back and the burn scar on her left wrist aching the way it always ached in the damp, and she hammered and fitted and cursed under her breath, and slowly, patch by ugly patch, she made the place shed water instead of swallow it, and when the first real rain came, and she lay dry in her blankets and listened to it drum on the tin, and not a drop fell on her, she felt, for one small hour, like she had won something. For money, she had the hens. She'd brought 6 of them, in a crate lashed to Barrow's back, poor scrawny things, but they laid, and eggs were eggs. Twice a week, she made the long walk into Marrow Hollow with a basket on her arm and sold what she could door to door, and endured what came with the selling. The women bought from her, most of them, but they bought the way you give alms, a pity so thick she could have spread it on bread. "You poor thing," they said, "and, all the way out there, all alone, and, you needn't be too proud, dear," and every soft word of it landed like a coin dropped into a beggar's cup. She took their money and thanked them evenly, and gave them not 1 inch of the satisfaction of seeing it sting. Let them think her beaten. She knew she was not, and for now that knowing was a private country she could retreat into and shut the gate. Only at Widow Pruitt's blue door was it different. There the old woman would make her sit and drink something hot and be a person for half an hour instead of a spectacle. They'll tire of it, Pruitt told her once, meaning the town, the talk, the laughing. They always tire of a thing, given time. You just outlast them, girl, that's the whole trick of it. And Della, warming her scarred wrist against a tin cup, thought it the truest thing anyone had said to her since her husband died. So the days went, hard and narrow and grey, and she might have gone on that way through the whole of that spring if it hadn't been for the mule. It started so small she nearly didn't mark it. There was a patch of ground just off the corner of the toll house, over by the old gate, the toll gate itself, or what was left of it, a leaning post and a length of rotted timber that had once swung down across the road to stop a wagon until its driver paid to pass. The ground there was no different from any other, to Della's eye, bare dirt, packed hard, a few stubborn weeds, but Barrow had taken a notion to it. She found him one evening standing over that patch, with his grey old head lowered, snuffling, pawing at the dirt with one forehoof, slow and deliberate. She clucked her tongue and tugged the rope, and he came, but reluctant, dragging, turning his head back toward that one spot as she led him away. The next morning he was there again. She'd staked him on good grass down by the water, but somehow in the night he'd worried the stake loose and walked himself all the way back to the toll gate, and there she found him at dawn, pawing at that same dirt, and now and again lifting his ragged old head and letting out a bray, a long, mournful, insistent sound that rolled out over the river and echoed back off the mouth of the bridge, as though he were calling to something, as though something down there were answering. "There's nothing there, you old fool," she told him, and led him off again, and again by morning he was back. It went on like that for days. She would move him, and he would return. She would tie him fast, and he would work himself free with a patience that would have been admirable in the service of anything but this. He pawed until he'd worn the weeds clean away and scraped a shallow raw hollow in the dirt, and his braying became a thing she heard in her sleep, and no amount of scolding or coaxing would break him of it. He was not a frightened animal, that was the strange part, the part that got under her skin and stayed. He did not act spooked, he acted certain, the way he'd acted the day the bank man came for him and she'd kept the rope planted, immovable, sure of a thing he had no way to explain. By the end of a week, Della was exhausted, and short of temper, and heartsick in a way she couldn't have named, and she'd had enough. She came out one grey evening, with the light going long and cold across the water, and there he was, of course, head down over that worn patch, pawing, braying, calling to whatever had no business being there. She looked at him a while, this stubborn old animal that was the last thing she had in the world, and something in her simply gave way, not in defeat, but in surrender of a different kind. If he would not leave it be, then she would settle it. She would dig the full spot up and show him there was nothing under it but dirt and stone, and then perhaps they could both rest. "All right," she said to him, low. "Have it your way. You've had it your way about everything else." She went to the lean-to and took down the spade from its nail, the good iron spade her husband had once turned a garden with in another life, and carried it back to the toll gate in the failing light. Barrow lifted his head and watched her come, then stepped back, deliberate, off the bare worn dirt, as if to make room, as if he had only ever been waiting for her to understand. Della set the blade where he had pawed it bare, put her boot to it, and pushed it down into the cold ground of the Coldwater Turnpike, and began to dig. The gate had guarded its secret well, and the earth gave it up slowly, as though reluctant to part with what it had held so long. Della drove the spade down again, and this time it did not sink into soil. It rang. A dull, flat clang travelled up the handle and into the bones of her wrists, and she froze with her breath caught beneath her ribs. Barrow went suddenly still behind her, his torn ear swivelling forward, his grey muzzle lowered as if he too were listening. She knelt in the wet grass and brushed the dirt back with her bare hands, not trusting the spade to be gentle. Her fingers found metal, cold and pitted with rust, the corner of something square and stubborn buried 1.5 feet beneath the toll gate. She scraped and pried until the shape of it emerged from the clay, an iron strongbox, no larger than a breadbasket, banded with straps time had eaten to lace, its lid sealed shut with a hasp gone the colour of old blood. She sat back on her heels and stared a long moment at the thing her mule had found. It took her the better part of an hour to work it loose, and another to break the seized hasp with a chisel and a stone she used for a hammer. When at last the lid gave, it did not swing but groaned, hinging back with a shriek that sent a jay startling out of the sycamore across the road. And then Della was looking down into the strongbox of Elias Crane, the bridge right, sealed, since the year the turnpike closed, and she forgot how to breathe entirely. Gold, not much of it by the measure of kings, but more than she had ever seen or thought to see, turnpike tolls in coin, some worn smooth by the hands of travellers dead these 40 years, some bright still where it had lain wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. It caught the thin sun and threw it back at her, warm and impossible, and she made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. But it was not the gold that made her sit down hard in the grass. It was what lay beneath it. Wrapped in the same oilcloth, tied with a cord that crumbled at her touch, were papers. Deeds. She unfolded them with the care of a woman handling something holy, and there in a clerk's careful copperplate, faded but legible, were the words that changed everything. The deed to the Coldwater Turnpike, covered bridge, entire and unencumbered. The deed to the toll house, and the land it stood upon, her land, the fool's purchase she had bought for $12, while the whole of Marrow Hollow laughed behind their hands. And beneath that, in a heavier hand, the water rights, the whole run of Coldwater Creek where it passed beneath the bridge, the mill privilege, the right to dam and draw and let flow, granted to the toll-keeper's estate in perpetuity, and never once surrendered. Della sat among the wet grass with the deeds in her lap, and understood, slowly, the way one understands a thing too large to take in at once, that she was not poor, that she had not been poor since the moment she handed over her last $12. She had only not known it. Beneath the deeds was the ledger, a thick book, its cover warped, its pages foxed at the edges but whole. Elias Crane had kept his accounts the way a careful man keeps them, in a small slanting hand, every crossing noted, every toll set down across the years the turnpike lived. Della turned the pages with a growing stillness, and came at last to the reckoning that the town of Marrow Hollow had spent 40 years praying no one would ever read. For when the county had wished to run its new road through, and had needed the Coldwater Bridge to carry its wagons and its trade before the new span was built, the town had crossed. Season upon season, load upon load, the wagons of Marrow Hollow had rolled over Elias Crane's bridge and paid nothing, on the promise, written here, signed here, witnessed here, that the toll-keeper's estate would be made whole when the town could pay. And then Crane had died with no heir anyone could find, the strongbox had gone into the ground, and the promise had gone with it, and the town had let the bridge rot and called it worthless, rather than remember what it owed. Years of crossing fees, set down in a dead man's hand, sworn and signed, owed to the estate of the toll-keeper. Owed, now, to the woman who held its deeds in her lap, with mud drying on her knuckles. Della closed the ledger. Barrow came and put his grey muzzle down against her shoulder and breathed his warm hay-smelling breath into her braided hair, and she reached up and laid her hand along his torn ear the way she did when the nights were bad. "You knew," she said to him, quietly, and her voice shook only a little. "All this time, you old fool, you knew." She did not go running into town. That was not her way, and besides, she had learned that a thing shouted is a thing disbelieved. She wrapped the deeds and the ledger back in the oilcloth, carried the strongbox into the toll house and set it beneath the loose floorboard where she kept the little she had, and slept that night with her hand upon it. In the morning she washed her face and put on the patched grey dress that was the only one she owned, and walked the 3 miles into Marrow Hollow to the office of Marshal Dobbs. He was a fair-minded man, old enough to remember when the Coldwater Bridge still carried trade, moustached and slow-spoken, in the long brown coat he wore in every season. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most in that town would have done, and when she laid the deeds on his desk and opened the ledger to the pages that mattered, his eyes went still and careful, and he was a long time reading. "Where did you come by these?" he said at last. "Not unkindly, only a lawman needing to be sure." "Beneath my own toll gate," Della said, in Elias Crane's strongbox. "My mule found the spot. I did the digging." Marshal Dobbs held the deeds to the window and studied the seals, the clerk's hand, the county mark pressed into the wax. He read the water rights twice, the ledger a third time, and when he set it down, he let out a breath through his moustache and looked at her with something she had not seen from any soul in Marrow Hollow but old Widow Pruitt. Something like respect. "These are genuine," he said. "I've no doubt of it. I knew Crane's hand. He signed the papers on my father's land. The seals are true, the county mark is true, and the law is plain. The bridge is yours. The land is yours. The water rights," and here he paused, as though the size of it wanted saying carefully, "the water rights are worth more than every acre in this valley put together, for there's not a mill nor a farm below the ridge that doesn't draw from Coldwater Creek, and every drop of it passes under your bridge." He tapped the ledger, "and this is a debt the town has owed for 40 years, sworn and signed, and by any court in the state it falls to you to collect." Della folded her hands in her lap. "How much," she asked, "does the town owe?" The marshal did the sum with a pencil, and when he turned the paper to her, she looked at the figure and felt the whole weight of the year behind her, the debt her husband's death had left, the $12, the eggs sold one by one, the roof patched against the rain, all of it lift and turn to something weightless. It was more than the town could pay in 10 years of its taxes. Word of a thing like that does not keep. By the time Della walked back down the main street, the news had gone before her the way fire goes through dry grass, and the town that had laughed at the widow's fool purchase came out onto its porches to watch her pass, and not one of them was laughing now. The miller's wife, who had turned her face away at church, the men who had sat on the store steps and called after her that she'd bought herself a pile of rotten timber and a road to nowhere, they looked at her and looked away, and she walked on past with her chin level and her grey eyes calm, and she did not gloat, though a smaller woman might have been forgiven for it. Silas Hone was waiting outside his store. He had been the loudest of them all. It was Silas who had sold her the spade and nails on credit and remarked, loud enough for her to hear, that he'd never known a woman fool enough to pay good money for a haunted ruin. Silas, who had weighed her eggs light and paid them short, and told her she ought to be grateful for anything at all. And now he stood in his doorway with his thumbs in his vest and his colour high, and she saw that he had put on a smile, and that the smile did not fit him well. "Mrs. Rourke, Della, I always did say that Toll House had good bones, sound investment. I said so from the first, didn't I, boys?" He glanced about for the boys, but the men on the steps had found other places to look. Now, seeing as we're neighbours, I wonder if you and I mightn't come to some arrangement over that water. My brother-in-law's got the mill down at the bend, you'll recall. And I recall your prices, misters. Hone, Della said. The colour went out of his face and came back redder. She let him stand in that silence a long moment, and the whole street watched it. She had earned the right to charge him for his water drop by drop, to run his brother-in-law's mill dry in a summer and call it justice. The ledger in her arms gave her the whole of it, sworn and signed. But Della Rourke had buried a husband and dug a strong box out of the cold ground with her own 2 hands, and she had learned that a life built on grievance is only another kind of debt, and it compounds. She had no wish to do to another soul what the year of scorn had done to her, not even this one. "You'll have your water, Mr. Hone," she said, "the same as everyone below the ridge. I'll not charge a farthing for what the good Lord sends down the creek. It was never mine to sell." She watched the relief break over his broad face, and then added, quiet and level, "But you'll weigh honest from this day on. Every farmer's eggs, every widow's butter. Because I'll know if you don't, and this valley drinks from my creek. Do we understand one another?" He took off his hat, which she had never once seen him do for her, and said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice gone small, and she nodded to him the way one nods to a neighbour, and walked on home. As for the town's debt, the 40 years of unpaid crossings set down in Elias Crane's ledger, Della thought long on it through the autumn. She could have taken it, and no court would have blamed her. But Marrow Hollow was full of people who had done her no harm, and some who could scarce feed their own, and the debt was owed by the town and not by any one soul in it, and to collect it would be to grind faces already thin. So on a bright cold morning she went again to Marshal Dobbs, and before him and the selectmen she signed the debt away, the whole of it, forgiven and struck from the book. She asked only one thing in its place, that the town lend its hands, not its money, to the restoring of the bridge, so that the Coldwater Turnpike might carry trade again, and every farm in the valley be the richer for it. And that they did, gladly, and with something like shame turning slowly into something like pride. The winter she spent on the toll house, and by spring it no longer leaked. The summer she and the men of Marrow Hollow spent on the bridge, and by the first frost the cold-water-covered bridge stood sound again, its shingles new, its great timbers scraped and pinned, the roof tight against the weather that had been trying for 40 years to bring it down. Wagons rolled over it once more, and Della sat in the mended toll house and took a fair toll from those who could pay, and waved through those who could not, and the road that had been a road to nowhere became once again the shortest way to everywhere. Widow Pruett came to live with her before the second winter, the thin, stooped old woman in her faded blue shawl, who had been the only one to show her kindness in the black months, who had brought her a loaf when she had nothing and never once looked at her as though she were a fool. Della would have it no other way. The two of them kept the toll house together, the young widow and the old, and in the evenings Pruett would sit by the fire and tell the stories of the valley as it had been, and Della would mend by the lamplight, and the burn scar on her wrist ached less than it once had. Or perhaps she only minded it less, and Barrow, the stubborn old plough mule with his grey muzzle and his one torn ear, who had pawed and brayed at a patch of worn ground until a woman with nothing left to lose finally dug, grew fat and easy in the good grass by the gate. He grazed there in the long light of the evenings, close by the toll gate he had guarded without knowing why, and sometimes Della would come out and stand beside him with her hand on his shoulder and watch the wagons cross the bridge that was hers, over the water that was hers, and she would think of Elias Crane, whom she had never known, tall and white-bearded in the memory of the old ones, and she would think that a road remembers its keepers, and chooses them in its own slow way. She had come to Marrow Hollow with a dead man's debts and a stubborn mule and $12 she could not spare, and the town had called her a fool. She had chosen grace over spite when spite lay ready in her hand, and she had gained a bridge, a home, a friend at her hearth, and the quiet regard of the people who had scorned her. The road had needed a keeper. It had waited a long time in the cold, and in the end it had gotten the one it deserved, and so had she.